This presentation is on a lecture that I've given several times at conferences, certainly over the past 5 or 6 years, where I looked at the effect of advertising and the sales workforce upon our clinical practice. The lecture was called "In the Land of Uncertainty is the Salesman King?" And I suppose I'm trying to reflect that when we're not 100% certain about our treatments, and in other presentations I've said that we're not, where there is a lack of evidence, do we perhaps fall more readily towards the salesperson or the clinical salesperson promoting certain types of treatment? A good place to start here is to consider what our patients want from their care. While we can accept that they want straight teeth, what else do they need or require from treatment? Well, first of all, there's no doubt that most patient value studies have suggested that patients would like treatment that is shorter than we normally provide. Of course, they don't want any discomfort when their appliances are adjusted. And they want instant alignment. Really, they'd like to see their malocclusion improve as soon as the brackets or any type of appliances are placed. They want a good social six, that is the visible part of the teeth that they see and the occlusion that they see, and of course they want this to be improved. And they want an early finish. I think one of the things that feeds back constantly on patient-based research is that our patients in fact want treatment not to be prolonged by trying to obtain absolutely perfect occlusions, which of course we always try to do. So what do the salespeople promise? They promise all sorts of things. They promise all the things that those patients required in previous studies. They want their teeth. They promise that our treatments will be short. They'll be less painful. We don't need cooperation. We can speed the rate of tooth movement up. We can correct buccal occlusions easily with magic appliances. They really promise everything. And why do they do this? Well, it's fairly straightforward. The salesperson has perhaps a different role than we clinicians, and their role is to sell their products. And of course they advertise to do this and they make claims. And those claims don't always need to be 100% accurate. And it's up to us to evaluate the sales pitch using our scientific knowledge. And if we don't do that, then we are falling into the sort of, it's not really a trap, but that sort of tendency to move to the next best thing that's been promoted by advertising. Because if we do that, we become the salespeople, and there's a danger of that all the time within orthodontics at the moment. So I thought one of the good things to start this presentation really is to think about, what do I know about orthodontics? And it's fairly straightforward and simple. I'm a simple orthodontist. Firstly, arch dimension should mostly be accepted. You can't expand every arch, and there's probably no need to expand every arch to avoid extractions. Functional appliances mainly tip teeth. There's a small skeletal component, but it's not very big, and we can't always rely on it. So functional appliances, particularly class 2 correctors, just tip teeth. They flare the lower incisors forwards and retrocline the upper incisors. Extractions work and are necessary. There's nothing wrong with taking out teeth. You're not an orthodontic hero if you treat everybody in an extraction. And in fact, we know that extraction treatment is frequently more difficult than non-extraction treatment. Class 1 molar non-extraction treatment is easy. As I've said, simple lineups are not complicated to experienced practitioners, and we shouldn't always regard ourselves as orthodontic heroes when we do that. You can only move upper molars back by 2 millimeters. It's interesting that we drive molars back according to the sales speak. We don't drive them, we just tip them and tilt them and derotate them back by about 2 millimeters, and no more than that. Certainly not enough to correct a full unit class 2 molar relationship. What else do I know? Wire properties don't influence the efficiency of the alignment. The teeth do not recognise the wires that are fitted. And equally so, there's no such thing as non-compliance treatment. Every treatment that we provide requires some form of compliance. And in a similar way to wire, bracket design doesn't really influence anything. There are no magic brackets. In fact, probably the greatest influence on treatment effectiveness and efficiency is probably the operator and not the brackets or the wires. And of course, relapse occurs, we don't know why it occurs, and it's almost impossible for us to prevent this. So what does the salesperson say? What are the claims that are made to persuade us to buy appliances? One of the best examples recently has been self-ligation, and I've written and talked about self-ligation a lot before now. This really was a reinvention, particularly by Ormco and Damon, of appliances that have been around for several decades. But this time round, claims were made about the appliances in terms of being able to treat cases in an extraction, because the brackets were tied in, because the wires were tied in and locked into the brackets very well, treatment was faster, there was greater slop within the brackets, so treatment was more comfortable. There were many claims made about self-ligation, and this bandwagon was jumped on by an awful lot of orthodontists. In fact, I began to feel a bit left out because I was a bit late to start using self-ligating brackets. When I did, I found they were great. I really liked the little clicky thing which held the wire in place. However, I wasn't happy with the finishes. Everything seemed to be under-torqued, and in a lot of my cases I actually switched them for MBT conventional brackets in order to finish. So self-ligation, in my opinion, and sort of my study of one, I didn't really like. But the advertising continued, and it was only when trials were published that we actually knew more about self-ligation. Because really we have to see, well, what was the evidence that was around to promote those concepts that they introduced. This was a blog post that I wrote very early on in my blog in 2014, where I was looking at the evidence about self-ligation, and really we looked very closely at several trials and systematic reviews that were being carried out at that point. And the evidence really is there's probably 8 randomised controlled trials that are of high quality. There's 1 systematic review and a statement by the American Association of Orthodontics, which really states quite clearly that self-ligating brackets are no better than conventional brackets. There are no advantage of using self-ligating brackets. So again, we have to answer that question, so what? Well, I think we can say that self-ligation is a good idea. The concept is good. The engineering is good on contemporary self-ligating brackets, and they are enjoyable to use because we're not using modules, and you do get full wire engagement right from the start of treatment. However, the treatment and its philosophy, and it's that sort of introduction of a philosophy, has been influenced very heavily by gurus who have been highly paid by the self-ligating company brackets, and they still make many of the claims that they made in the past, even in the presence of evidence that suggests that they're talking nonsense. And absurd claims were made at that point, and they have been, as I've said, been disproved. I think the best way to think about this is it's a bracket, not a philosophy. I always think it was interesting that we heard people described as Damon doctors, as if they were special, or I follow the Damon philosophy. That's not necessarily correct. We're orthodontists, we do work within narrow parameters about what we can and can't do. And I think when someone develops something new and calls it a philosophy, there is that sort of fear of missing out. So that concept of a philosophy, in my view, is complete nonsense. It's a bracket that we stick on the teeth and we move teeth with it. So in terms of a discussion, we have to think, is the theory of self-ligation good? In some ways it is. I don't go for the light forces causing the bone to grow and expand and sort of reinventing the concepts that Angle introduced years ago, which were proved not to be totally correct. So in some aspects the theory of self-ligation is good, in others it's complete nonsense. We have to consider that in trials there were no differences between the two types of bracket. And that probably is because the operators are compensating for the deficiencies and the advantages of the different appliance systems, coupled with the fact that there is probably no advantage in terms of the biomechanics of a self-ligating bracket over a conventional bracket when both are used properly. The philosophy is complete nonsense. In many ways I think it was made up, and an awful lot of people fell for the philosophy. And that perhaps explained why the selling was so successful. There was a sort of a fear of missing out, and I think that's where the selling was very clever. There was a fear that you'd be missing out on providing a certain type of treatment and that you were falling behind the sort of wave of a new type of orthodontics, and so the selling was so successful. And we'll look at that in a little more detail in the second part of this presentation, where I'll look at the effect of the salesman and the dentist on our prescribing of brackets and various vibratory appliances and methods of creating trauma to the alveolus with a hope of speeding up the rate of tooth movement. The second part of this lecture follows on the website and is a little longer than this initial introduction.